So this is our first webinar that we are organizing related to ICH and research from Finnish Folk Music Institute, and our plan is to continue this for maybe 3 or 4 times in a year. And we have also research program, including many activities like seminars, webinars, research projects, and we have a steering group for this research program, including me and our director, Matti Häkämäki. Also Heidi Henriikka Mäkelä is part of our steering group, and Vilma Timonen and Saija-Leena Rantanen. So we have all planned these webinars, and we have themes like ICH in Finland, and then traditional music cultures. But of course, we try to work as internationally as possible, and these webinars are organized with collaboration with Nordic Baltic Network on ICH, and we have also received funding from Nordic Culture Point. And we are interested, of course, in other domains as music also, because that way we can understand in a broader way what ICH really is. And we have 3 inspiring speakers today here. So first, Dr. Janet Blake, who works in the University of Shahid Beheshti and has written several books on and articles on safeguarding intangible cultural heritage. And Janet knows the convention from a long period of time. And it was really great honor for us, Janet, that you could join us today. And after Janet's presentation, we have asked Dr. Hanna Schreiber from University of Warsaw, Poland, to take a role as a discussant for maybe 5 to 10 minutes. And Hanna has also experienced to work with the convention from many perspectives, as an official national delegation, as a university representative, and an accredited NGO represented in the committee meetings. And Hanna has also published many articles related to ICH. And so we hear Hanna's comments and ideas right after Janet's presentation, and then we can move to questions to Janet and Hanna both. So please, Janet, the floor is yours. Great that you came here.
Okay, thank you very much. And I will just be sharing my screen, hopefully. Let's hope this works. Yeah. Right, it should, I hope it's not come up, is it? It takes time from here, I'm afraid. So until it does arrive, I will. Are you seeing it yet?
Yes, we are seeing it.
Okay, good, right. I'm sorry, there's a little bit of a time delay from here, but I hope my sound is okay, yeah? You can hear me all right? Good, fine. So you see that I've done my best as a legal expert to put a few pictures for you. Not my usual presentation, but you see on this slide a picture of the oud from Syria, because Syria and Iran this year have inscribed the oud and the knowledge, the craftsmanship related to the oud on the international list of the 2003 convention. So today I'm going to introduce the convention briefly, and then after that look very specifically at the question of research and researchers, because it's 2 related and separate issues, I think. The role within the convention. So let's start by a little bit of background here, that the 2003 convention has grown out of several different as it were roots, but one of the important ones was in the 1980s, and the understanding of culture in international law underwent a major shift with this meeting in Mexico, where the Mexico City Declaration was adopted in 1982. And as you see from the quotation I've put here, that this very much shifted the dial on how culture was understood, away from a much more a sort of artistic high culture notion to one that's more anthropological, which is about all those different aspects of life that, as it says, characterize a society or a social group, and including ways of living, ways of thinking, ways of being. And you can see, therefore, how intangible cultural heritage very much falls within this notion of culture. And then in 1989, UNESCO adopted a recommendation on what was then known as traditional culture and folklore, the safeguarding of that. I should mention that this is the first time the word safeguarding is used in a heritage field internationally. And that's quite important, because safeguarding is not just about the element, the artifact, the monument itself. It's about the human society that surrounds it. So it's an idea that goes beyond protection, that we have to also, as it were, protect the rights and the way of life of people who are the bearers of this heritage. Now, this recommendation, yes, it was a flawed document, as we shall see in the next slide, but it was a really important step on the way. You know, it was a necessary step to make before we reached the 2003 convention, particularly because it focused on a broad cultural approach to safeguarding, putting the material culture within its broader, let's say, cultural model that it belonged to. And second, for you, it's interesting that ethnologists and folklorists played a very important role in the development of this recommendation. And there was an ethnologist from Finland whose name I just cannot remember, I apologize, who played, you know, a pretty important part in this process. And I certainly met him at one or two meetings early on, late 90s. And so, you know, the folklorist and ethnological tradition in your country definitely played a role in the development of this treaty. So 10 years after the recommendation, a major conference was held in Washington at the Smithsonian, which I think in itself is significant, given the Smithsonian's very important place in anthropology, ethnography, and of course, musicology with the Smithsonian Traditional Music Collection. And, you know, it was very much to assess the convention after 10 years, I mean, the recommendation, sorry. And a major criticism was, interestingly enough, that this document was too much reflecting the interests of the research community. Written from the point of view of people who study the heritage and for whom the heritage bearers in the classic model are more of sort of passive interviewees rather than active in the safeguarding paradigm. So it was recommended that a new standard setting instrument be developed. It wasn't clear at this stage if it would be a treaty or not, but that's what it turned out to be. And also, interestingly enough, to avoid using the term folklore. Why? Because for certain cultures, particularly indigenous cultures of the Pacific, folklore is perceived as being a somewhat denigratory term, probably because of the connection between colonialism and the anthropological research and folkloric research that is associated with it in that region. I know that this is not the same perception in Eastern Europe and probably also in Scandinavia from your history, but it is worth pointing that fact out. And I also want to note that Anthony Seeger, who at the time was the curator and a director emeritus at the Smithsonian Folkways Institute and in charge of the recordings of traditional music, that he was one of the main players in setting up this conference and in informing the background documents of the conference. Also that the international, is it the Association of Traditional Music, which is an NGO that is now accredited to the 2003 convention, as is your NGO also, Outi, that they were also very involved in particularly the negotiations, the intergovernmental negotiations, that they were observers, but observers who did, manage to give quite a useful input to the development of the treaty. And in fact, also later were one of the institutes that were relied upon for assessing files for nomination to the international list, the representative list, before an alternative system was established in the convention. So let's very quickly just consider what exactly intangible cultural heritage is for the 2003 convention. And you see from this that it's definitely much more than the artifact. In fact, it's primarily the knowledge and the know-how and the skills associated with it, as well as what is expressed through it. For example, with regard to traditional music, of course, very much the traditional lyrics and poetry, as well as the music itself, would be the expressions here. But at the same time, the instruments and the objects, the artifacts, etc., are also important. So that involves the musical instruments, but also the tools that are required for making them, as well as other objects that may be somehow associated with performance, and the cultural spaces, which I think is very interesting notion here. That very often traditional music is performed in rituals and with regard to social practices, and these are types of cultural spaces. And importantly, that for some reason, oh yes, I can't see all of my screen, which is why I have trouble sometimes, but that the communities, the groups, and in some cases individuals themselves recognize this as their heritage. This self-identification is very key. And notice that we talk about these three, as it were, groupings, two groupings, and the individuals. The communities, because they're the wider bearer community, who may be active or may be more passive, depending on the role they play. Groups who are likely to be, let's look at traditional music. They could be the artisans who make the instruments, and the players who play them, obviously. The librettists, if we're talking about music for which a libretto is written, or an adapted libretto, whatever. And in some ways, the audience is also a group, you could argue. So they're like smaller groups within the community. And individuals are mentioned partly because of course, sometimes you have individual exponents who are regarded as masters who transmit to their students, but also it's a recognition of the human rights context of the convention. Human rights are recognized generally as individual rights in international law, and this reminds us that safeguarding this heritage is very much about safeguarding the rights of the bearers of this heritage. And I just point out one other aspect, the idea of transmission from generation to generation is a very key aspect also, excuse me, of our understanding. And therefore, very often, a primary focus of safeguarding is safeguarding the mode of transmission. And in the modern world, often, the traditional mode of transmission may be rather difficult to sustain, in which case it may even be a case of seeing how alternative modes of transmission can be found. And the convention explains that this heritage is found in different domains, and the convention then describes 5 typical domains in which it is found. But I do emphasize strongly that these are typical, they're there to give some guidance, and they are by no means exhaustive in that we can add to these domains. And many countries already do so. I mean, we have countries who have added traditional games, traditional sports, cuisine, you know, etc. So this is not a closed list by any means. And notice I have highlighted 4 out of the 5 because these 4 clearly relate to what you do. Actually, in many ways, I could have highlighted the knowledge and practices concerning nature and the universe too, since that also relates to natural resources. And since musical instruments are very often, well, not very often, are pretty much always made using natural resources, whether it be particular wood from particular trees or bamboo or even animal skins, catgut, whatever, you know, so have some connection with that. But clearly oral traditions and expressions are very at the, you know, at the forefront, as are performing arts. And equally social practices, rituals and festive events, because there's so often the places in which this music is performed, and traditional craftsmanship, clearly it has its role to play. And I mention again that many of the typical examples of elements that are inscribed in this area related to music cover both the craftsmanship and the playing. And then in the description, they often cover also the social practice. So the point I'm making here is that your subject of research interest covers really all of the 5 domains mentioned in the convention one way or another, which, apart from anything else, shows that by undertaking research in this area, you are contributing to the safeguarding of this heritage. I just give this example from Iran and Azerbaijan of the playing the, what is in Iran, the Kamanche, in Azerbaijan is the Kamancha. You do sometimes get these inscriptions which have a very long title because you have all the different possible names of the element in the different languages of the countries. Interesting that, again, it is the art of crafting and playing that is focused on in the title. And also the fact that it's multinational, because increasingly we are seeing these nominations of several countries together. And in the Baltic region, of course, one of the early nominations was Baltic Songs and Dances, I think it's called in the inscription. And so traditional music is clearly a part of that element, a big part of it. And it has been, it's quite a celebrated example of extremely positive international cooperation within the framework of the convention. So I'm not going to go through this in detail, just to see that apart from one thing, that this is a very ancient instrument. So that, you know, we don't require everything to be as ancient as this I mentioned. I mean, usually the transmission requirement assumes something like 3 or 4 generations of transmission. Although recent inscriptions have challenged this, so let's see where that one goes. And that, as it said, you know, we again have the mention of the social and cultural gatherings, the social environment in which music is played, as well as a number of different types of bearers and practitioners who are mentioned that speaks to the different social groups associated with the heritage. And notice also that there is this mention of the economic aspect of the playing the instrument. In other words, sometimes you hear, not sometimes, quite a lot, you hear some very negative views of commercialization associated with intangible heritage. And there are good reasons for that. However, it's also very important to bear in mind that many of these elements had some economic objective as part of their being from the beginning, and therefore it's not always something we should separate from the element. I just wanted to add that as a side issue of research. So now this is perhaps the international lawyer in me coming out, but it is quite a significant point for at least those of us who look at international law, just how far the whole process of developing this convention and, really importantly, implementing and pushing, driving forward the implementation has been interdisciplinary. And in fact, in many ways, non-legal disciplines have driven the process much more than you find in many other areas of law. I say in the first paragraph, yes, it's not unusual for international law to look to other disciplines, because to regulate those, it's necessary to understand them from a policy perspective. But the degree to which you have particularly cultural anthropologists, ethnologists, and others of related disciplines, including ethnomusicologists, involved in early development, drafting, and later implementation of this treaty has been perhaps unusually high. Now, this is very big, great benefits, and is actually essential for regulating this area, which is really very new as a conception, especially in the legal field, and still relatively poorly understood as a subject of both policy setting and regulation. Believe me, in many countries, the governmental authorities tasked with implementing the convention still find it very challenging to work their heads around the notion of intangible cultural heritage, especially those that are staffed by, let's say, archaeologists and architects, as is the case of Iran. So, we really need this input from other disciplines. But it has its pitfalls as well, that lawyers also have a role to play here. The problem is, and I can see Hannah smiling at this, that in many ways the problem has come from the legal side. This convention is very challenging to a lot of legal experts who don't really feel it's traditional law. And there hasn't necessarily been a significant engagement also from lawyers until recently. The good news is that I think there's an increasing number of particularly younger lawyers who are engaging with this convention. And so we will see that increasingly go forward, which is great. But also I would really make a strong call here that for research, as far as possible, to try to have multidisciplinary research projects about this convention, where especially the public policy objective is clearly understood from the beginning, and maybe to include policy experts or legal experts in the team if possible, so that connection is made and where it's really necessary to make that connection. As I say, interdisciplinary cooperation was fundamental to developing this convention, and it had certain effects. And the major one is that it really shifted the paradigm of heritage safeguarding protection, so that we moved away from a very top-down, state-driven approach, as well as, I should say, very much Western-oriented understanding of heritage. In fact, it's not just Western, it's sort of up to about somewhere like Iran. I would make the cutoff to the east of Iran somewhere, and maybe the south, on this conception of what is heritage. I mean, we could say that going west and south, Latin America, Africa, and then further east to the Pacific, whatever, well, many countries and cultures felt that the World Heritage conception didn't speak to their heritage, which is very much about this intangible aspect. Interestingly enough, now that we have the convention, there are also a lot of countries in Western Europe that are starting to realize increasingly that this heritage is also important to them in a way they didn't realize before. Even including the UK government might actually one day become a party to the convention. But one of the strong influences here was from human rights, and also the wider context of development policy. And this had the effect that human values were placed much more centrally in the whole idea of heritage protection and safeguarding. Cultural diversity and mutual respect were also forefronted in a way they weren't before. The participatory approach of the convention, which is from, and this is important, it goes from the identification of what is heritage right through designing the safeguarding projects and planning, the policy making through to the management. This is the ideal. It doesn't work that way in practice very often, but that is the idea. And the connection with sustainable development is part of that. So all of this, you know, is the interdisciplinary character of the development of the convention has had some very important impacts on placing the convention within a wider picture. Now, obviously, the convention is about safeguarding intangible heritage. So we need to have some clear idea of what that implies and also where research falls within that. Primarily, the primary purpose of safeguarding is ensuring the viability of this heritage. Viability meaning its sustainability into the future, that it can continue to exist and be practiced. It may change its form in some way. I mean, that is one of the things we accept, the evolution of form, as long as the meaning doesn't change too much. And this includes the identification, documentation, and research related to this heritage. And identification, I include the notion of inventory making within identification and documentation. It's sort of part of that picture. So there are other actions too, but these are the ones which are perhaps most directly related to your area of interest. But you can see clearly from this that you know you have a place in this convention, a very central place. So we have these, I've made it 4 rather than 3 measures. Obviously, with identification, the heritage bearers should have a central place in this, with researchers working with them very often and supporting that. But I think it is rather a fundamental part of the paradigm here. It's no longer a case of external scientific experts almost saying this is your heritage, which has in the past happened. And the meaning of the heritage for sure is with the bearer community. Because I have heard, I have to say here in Iran, an anthropologist expert from our heritage organization telling me very clearly that the community, the bearer community, often doesn't understand their heritage. They tell them the wrong things because they're telling them something that's not in the books, but actually what they're saying is what's true. So there is a mindset shift that is required here. Now, inventorying, of course, is primarily administrative and technical as an activity, but of course, very often it's accompanied by documentation. So the question is, how is that documentation gathered and by whom? Sometimes, yes, by the governmental authority, but equally it may be, you know, we hope that the picture will rather be that if the bearer community already is playing a central role in this process, then they and the researchers working with them will be the ones providing this documentation on their own terms. Now, coming to research, this may relate to specific elements of ICH, but it could also more generally consider the impacts of safeguarding actions and those impacts on the heritage and on the bearers. And I think that that aspect is very important. And I'll come to that in the next slide. And documentation, of course, well, that's primarily what many of you do, and it could be at different levels, whether it's specifically for the purpose of inventorying or more generally and going more deeply for research purposes. And I think that this is the point that often research feeds into inventory making, but it's not necessarily the same thing. And the documentation collection is not always the same either. Sorry, I have a bit of a cough today. That's why I'm coughing at you. So I don't want to go into detail on the types of research. I'm sure you're aware of most of this. Into the elements themselves, surveying and cultural mapping has been a very important way of understanding simply what is present in a country, particularly in early years being a party to the convention. And this may be done on a geographic basis or sometimes an ethnic basis. Obviously, extensive and detailed written audiovisual documentation is being collected, has been collected in the past. And this actually is a very interesting question. I don't have time today, but I think one of the interesting questions is how research undertaken before the convention was in place, how that can actually feed into research for the safeguarding of ICH. Because it can, but it has to be done with understanding that the requirements are different requirements of research. But this last two, research into safeguarding policies, measures and related legislation, one, and also research into the impact of the safeguarding measures and policies, etc. These are sadly poorly represented in the literature. And this is where we really need to have much more research undertaken. And as I was saying before, the ideal is where your experiences in the field feed into the understanding of the policy-based research. I don't think that we should have these, separate areas of research where somebody says, I'm a policy specialist or a legal specialist, and someone else is a documentation and field research, etc. type specialist. No, I think we should see what we do as being on a continuum, and our understanding should come together in order to improve the safeguarding of this heritage through research. I'm not going to bother with this one. It's you can have a copy of these slides, so you can look at these. Just this slide reminds us that countries that are parties to the convention, the governments do have this requirement to foster scientific, technical, and artistic studies, as well as methodologies. I can't see that bit of the screen, sorry, with a view to the effective safeguarding, etc. So notice here that first funding, research funding, go along to your funding body and tell them that they now have an obligation to fund your research into ICH in this convention. The nature of the studies is not made clear. It's left pretty open, which is a positive. The mention of research methodologies is interesting because it reminds us that this is a new area and we really still have to spend time taking a step back and considering how such research is conducted, especially how the paradigm of community participation can actually be made possible within a research methodology, which I think is quite challenging because it's turning a lot of that methodology on its head. But I'm sure that if one can work on it, it could also be very, very fruitful in terms of what it provides. And also that effective safeguarding is an important focus of research within the convention. So that's not, that again is where we typically as academics, we have our own research interests, etc. But this is saying, fine, pursue your research interest, but with this focus on effective safeguarding, if it's research within the convention. Now, this last bit I just put out of sort of interest is to show how in the periodic reporting to the convention, which is what the states parties have to undertake every 6 years, and they have to report on what they've done to implement the convention. There are questions and indicators that are measured which relate really quite directly to various aspects of research. So, for example, this question 9.1, are they providing the financial support and other forms of support that's needed for research? And 9.2 is really focusing what I've been talking about, research on approaches towards and the impacts of safeguarding. So that's moving away from the element as the subject of research per se to the safeguarding approaches and the impacts of those, which is not actually, I placed that question within a policy framework, but it's not just a policy framework. I think it's equally and quite appropriately a framework for you as researchers to ask that question. And this last 9.3 is really challenging. Do practitioners and bearers participate in the management, design, implementation, dissemination? Is it? I don't know. I can't read the right-hand side of my screen. And dissemination of research findings, etc. So you see, this is really looking for a very deep level of involvement, and involvement as partners in research, which is quite important and quite a shift from how things have been done traditionally, with their free, prior, sustained and informed consent. And notice that the consent is not just free, prior and informed, it's also sustained, which suggests an ongoing relationship over time. And the next indicator that I have picked on, which is really interesting because it's asking what then is the place of research in strengthening policy making and improving safeguarding. So, first of all, are the communities, groups, and individuals given access of research into their element, while also respecting any customary practices that may restrict that access? Because very often, I think, in the past, the documentation has been collected and then it's been placed in a university archive, for example, or even at times a personal archive of the researcher and never seen again. But this is saying no, that the bearer community needs to have access to this in order to safeguard their element. And the second question under this indicator 10, that are the results of research and the documentation, etc., used to strengthen policy making across different sectors. So this is really the missing link here between the, scientific research carried out in the field, say, of musicology, and how that feeds into the policy making. The big question is, how can it feed into policy making? And it's a question for both sides. It's a question for the policy setters and the researchers to find an answer to that. And also, are the results used for safeguarding? Do they feed into better safeguarding in the future? In other words, is that now a question of your research project design, which is, in a way, this implies it will be. That's it. Thank you very much for your attention. And Hanna, I look forward to hearing what you have to say now. I'll just get rid of my slides. Stop share. Yep, there we go.
Thank you. Hanna, if you are ready, you can already continue.
Thank you. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. So first of all, thank you so much, Outi and Matti, for this so kind invitation. And it's really, as said previously, an honor for me to comment and to discuss points that were raised by Janet. And I will share with you my little secret. Janet's papers and reports and commentary to the convention were the first, opening eyes for me when I started my own research in ICH. So this is a really this is something very, very important for me. So, as I promised not to make a co-referate here, so I will just focus on 3 points that Janet has so clearly made. She made plenty of interesting observations and some recommendations for what for future paths, but I would like to focus on 3 things. So the research area that is ICH, which is so different from usual areas we operate in, and the blurred borders in the roles of researchers in the ICH area. I think this is what Janet told us when speaking about facilitating the process by engaging legal and non-legal experts into common discussion, into taking responsibility also for what is being done with ICH on the policy making level. So I think this is something quite important to understand, that no matter how we will try to avoid this and keeping our borders clear, it is not possible when it comes to ICH. And I think we as legal experts had to really quickly understand and learn ethnographic and musicologic terminology. And the same should happen the other way around. And let me share here maybe also some private history from Poland. When we were starting to discuss the implementation of the convention, these were ethnographers who were very critical and very upset with ICH as a term. They hated it. They said it is an imposition and this is not an anthropological language. Despite that, these were anthropologists who took part in drafting of the convention too, and they deliberately took the term to avoid these long entanglements of the folklore as a term. So it took us in Poland a decade to stop discussing whether we should even use the term ICH. And now this is a very prolific area of research and studies, but it's really on the mental level to convince people and to shift the research into what could be actually done with this took more years than I really thought it will. So the first thing, these blurred borders that are actually also creating a very specific situation where when we do not have any research objects, we are all subjects in the research right now. We do not have informants anymore, we have participants, and we are also participants, yes? We do not treat communities as those who should be enlightened with our expert knowledge anymore. We treat them as experts of their own heritage. So I think that this is something that really change a lot. And this was also a small revolution. And Janet very much emphasized the need to speak and to think about ICH in interdisciplinary terms. And this is still a homework that we must do, I believe. My sense of what is happening in the field is that we still do not have enough respect to what has been achieved by other disciplines. I would say that legal experts tend to, ignore ethnographic development in terms of auto-reflexivity, whereas ethnographers are ignorant about the differences between legal regulations that are hard law, like conventions, and what is the soft law instruments like declarations. And then I receive as a reviewer plenty of articles written by ethnographers who have no clue what is the convention about, but they criticize it. They write, I would say, even a parallel history of why the convention was adopted, but has no grounding in any preparatory works that was done with the convention. So I would say that we have done a lot when it comes to understanding of interdisciplinarity and the need to speak to each other, but still not enough. And this is a very worrying situation, because while we are still, I would say, doing our homework when it comes to speaking between and across social sciences and humanities, because when we think about law, folklore studies, ethnography, history, political science, they all belong to one family, social science and humanities. And we are right now observing the most incredible revolution that is happening in our lives, the one that is compared to the development of Google Chrome, which is the chatbot GPT. And while still doing our homework in social and science and humanities, we are now forced to speak to computer scientists. And I believe this is the very important step that has not been taken yet, and it must be taken yet. I'm not sure how far you are with playing with chatbot GPT, but we all now know in the academia, in the research field, that we cannot even ask our students anymore to write any essays as homework. It just doesn't make sense, because these essays are written by chatbot GPT, and this is done marvelously. Really, it's a very clever tool. And when it comes to music, I found that this chatbot GPT is already very, very able in writing songs, in writing poems, in generating music. And you can even ask GPT to create a specific style of a specific artist and genre or music genre. It can transcribe notes. So when it comes to music, I believe we can think creatively that in the next, not decade, it will happen in months, in a year or two. We can think of a chatbot that would be trained to folk music in Finland, that could be trained in a specific style of a folk musician from Finland who is old, and we know that we need to secure some transmission. And this could be done by chatbot GPT. And it not only is able to actually replay what has been installed to it, but it can creatively work with it. Unfortunately, I myself, I'm doing this research right now with computer scientists, and it's a completely new world. It's a completely new terminology. It's like a different planet for us, social scientists. And from what I see, this is something we should really take greater care right now, because this will completely change the future of the convention. And we are facing this revolution happening in front of our eyes right now. So these will be my points, and thank you once again for giving me time to share it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Janet, and thank you, Hanna, for your presentations. Maybe we take already to questions. I think Janet has had to leave a little bit earlier, so it would be great if you have any questions now, especially for Janet and also for Hanna. So maybe you can raise your hand or put the questions to the chat, whichever you would like to do. And you are free also to open your cameras if you want. Yes, Lena can start.
Hello, Janet and Hanna. So nice to see you both in this event. We are so privileged to have you here and to hear your thoughts. You've been working on this for so long. I coordinate the UNESCO 2003 convention here in Finland since 2014. And thanks for referring to the UNESCO periodic reporting process. We also worked really hard on that and submitted our 250-pager to UNESCO a year ago or something. And so there we also had a chance to have a closer look to what's happening in the research field in terms of ICH. My question to you both is, I mean, this is such a vast field, and what can we do as a government? You say that it's the obligation is to fund, and I also, I mean, my money back is not that big, and the weapon or the tool that I'm often offering is like, use the convention, say that the state of Finland is now part of this convention, and we should be supporting this and that. And actually lately in the media, we have heard, for example, especially on arts research and theater research, there was even a big, what's it called, opinion written in our main newspaper on that we are part of this convention, but why are all our fields, the funding is being cut all the time? But I mean, if you would have to give the advice for the governments or us as the implementers of the convention, where should we put the emphasis? It's such a wide field, and we hope the support from the research field, but then again, we cannot be there to say, study this or study that, and take a look at the community perspective or whatever. But what's your advice?
Well, I go first on this one, Hanna. Well, Lena, nice to see you first, and wow. Where does one begin? It's a very good and a very difficult question to answer. However, I think in a way, the way I'd answer it is to say, get together from the government side with the research community and hash this one out within that framework. That would be one. I think another, and this is something that has been kind of going around in my mind for some time. I think the research community in any country operating this convention is a very key vector for a lot of things in terms of the safeguarding. You know, rather like if you think about the good governance model, where you have kind of, you know, the population on the one side, the government on the other, and you have the research community in the middle as a broker between the two. So I think that one of the really key things is spreading the word. It's actually awareness raising amongst academic researchers, because that is something I have found is both needed and is very important, because, you know, people who are conducting field research, financed quite often by you, in areas that relate to intangible cultural heritage, if this knowledge of the convention is imparted, you know, it can then become one important part of safeguarding, and importantly of finding ways to engage bearer communities in the safeguarding process, because that's one of the big gaps, isn't it? So I think it's in a way not necessarily just about how do you focus your budget for research, which is an important question. I think it's something wider than that, is how does one bring researchers on board in the whole endeavor in such a way that what they will be doing anyway as part of their primary job becomes a part of the safeguarding of ICH. Because there is at the moment a gap between safeguarding ICH and research into all these related areas. And as, I mean, Hanna, I think, made an extremely important point here. There's an awful lot of critical anthropological literature out there, which, you know, yes, it's important to be criticized, but at the same time, it's good when criticism can be constructive. In other words, is based in a sufficient knowledge. And if you're criticizing an international treaty, very often the representative list, then, you know, let's start out by understanding what an international treaty is, how it operates, what its limitations are, etc. So you see, I think that it's a lot of it is about spreading word. But last, in a very directed response, you know, with you have funding priorities. I don't know how it's operated in Finland, whether you have different funding bodies for social science, arts and humanities, etc. You know, consider how the interdisciplinary aspect of funding can work. But I think it's a big discussion, and I would start having this discussion with your own researcher community, both informing them about the convention and then asking them how they see their research fitting within that.
So maybe only one addition from my side to build on what Janet just said about these funding opportunities, funding possibilities. And it was actually the Lena's question, yes, about the funds that are available. From what I can see, heritage sector is not where the money are. The big money are. And we are used to be unpaid, to be voluntary, to be, you know, missionaries for the sake of ICH. And we have really like a huge world, hugely overpaid. And I'm speaking about the IT sector. They say themselves they are overpaid, and they can do everything, but they just need direction. They need data, and they are happy to work with researchers from social sciences, with policymakers. They just need to be approached and they just need to be understood. And so my advice, very practical, will be, you know, try to find a bridge with them, and then you will find the money, and then you can go and move forward. That would be my advice.
I take next question from Vilma.
Hi, thank you so much, and very inspiring presentations. I'm a folk musician, educator from Sibelius Academy, University of the Arts, Helsinki. And lately I've been really thinking a lot about this dichotomy that is found in many of the texts related with the convention, and I think it came up today as well. We're making a division between researchers and the community. And what I'm kind of thinking, well, maybe referring also to some of the literature like Adele Bortolotto and associates who have kind of grasped this sort of artificial division that doesn't apply necessarily in today's world. It's not that straightforward. So it's sometimes a little bit difficult to kind of find a place in those dichotomies. Who am I if I am, I consider myself as a tradition bearer, but I'm like, what do we mean by community? What is the community, and what are the restrictions or borders for a community? When can we say that it is a community and it's not a community of practice, for instance? So this is something that is really triggering my mind. I was wondering if you could share some thoughts on that.
Well, I'm not sure I have a very sensible response to that, but except to say thank you. I think you have raised a point that's a very, very, very important one, that there is a tendency, to stick labels. And I think, for those of us sometimes who spend too much of our time in the rabbit hole of the 2003 convention, we do tend to say communities, groups, individuals, researchers, policymakers. I've been doing that today. You're right. We all have multiple identities, right? I mean, I'm Scottish, European, British, Iranian, as well as my professional identity. In other words, you're right that it's important we don't create these labels and they become so inflexible that somebody has to be labeled as X, even when they may be X and Y and Z at the same time. And that is part of the question, isn't it? I think that one way of looking at it, rather than stepping out of the labels and looking at the question of expertise and where expertise is located, because that is one of the really important messages of this convention, is that expertise is primarily located amongst those people we call the cultural community. In other words, the people most directly related to the element in question. And I think if we think of it in those terms, maybe that helps to break down the labels a bit, because if somebody happens to be both an academic researcher and a tradition bearer, well, then they will have more than one set of expertise. And interestingly enough, in that case, their expertise as a tradition bearer takes priority over the expertise as an academic researcher in the paradigm of the convention. There is also, I'd like to share with you a really nice image from the UN Special Rapporteur on Cultural Rights, the first one, Farida Shahid, who wrote a very, very interesting report on cultural rights and cultural heritage in 2011. And in part of that report, she describes the relationship of different actors and stakeholders with regard to heritage. And if we look at that idea with, talking about intangible cultural heritage, it's almost like you take a pebble and you drop it in water, and you know how you get the concentric circles. So you have the heritage in the middle, and then the first circle is the cultural cultural community, or let's say the practitioners, the ones who actually practice the heritage directly. Then you may have other members of that cultural community who play backroom roles or are slightly more passive in their connection to it. Then you have the wider local society who are not members of that cultural community. Then you may have a regional society, certainly a national one. And everybody has a relationship to this heritage, but the relationship's different. And from a human rights point of view, the priority is with those closest to the heritage in that picture. But I think it's, the point that's important here is that it is very much a multi-stakeholder picture, and that a variety of people have interests in safeguarding this heritage. And we have to respect all of those, for sure. And it's not an easy question to negotiate our way between all this, I think. But the first step is recognizing it, understanding it. I think really that's a fundamental step, because once we recognize it, then we have some self-awareness in what we do to take that on board. So I do hope I responded appropriately to your interesting point. Thanks.
Yes, thank you. I think we could take one really fast question, Jerzy Makarevich, if you want to raise a question for Janet, and then we can move forward.
So my question is, I'm started my PhD studies and I'm focusing on intangible heritage. So my question was how much, for example, we as researchers can step into their into their ICH sphere, or should we remain just observers and just note what is going on there, or how much can we act or intervene into the processes that are going on there?
Oh boy, I'm getting all the difficult questions today. Save some of these for Heidi afterwards, huh? I mean, this is, again, isn't it interesting? So much of the questions surrounding anything to do with this convention speak also to human rights. Yes, because this is actually, your question is as much as anything else, a question related to the relative rights of different individuals and actors with regard to the cultural rights that they call them the bearers have in their heritage. Yeah, I think it's certainly true. I mean, I don't know which particular discipline you're working in, but I'm assuming it's sort of related to ethnography somehow. Am I correct? Your PhD, which discipline?
In ethnology, but I'm focusing more on the heritage policies and not on the study of the elements themselves.
But you have the research. Okay, but your research methodology, you could say, is the ethnological one, yes?
More or less,
primarily.
Yeah.
Okay, because I'm not sure how much that sort of, I presume yours is I'm not an anthropologist or an ethnologist, okay? I'm a legal specialist, but I'm assuming that observation is a sort of primary position of your discipline, that traditionally yours would be take a step back and observe. Whereas, and in a way that's, I suppose, to do your PhD is what you are being asked to do. But the interesting thing is that since you're actually looking at it as intangible cultural heritage, then that introduces this other question for you. In other words, how far can you legitimately step outside your immediate discipline in order to follow, the paradigm of ICH research? In a way, what would be interesting almost for that to be a research question for you. Yeah, but I think, as I say, I'm not an expert in ethnology, but I guess my very simple response would be to say, ideally within the convention framework, you would regard the members of that bearer community as equals in terms of their knowledge of the element, if not more than equals, people who are the real experts, and try to partner with them, you know, rather than going in there already with a research questionnaire prepared to ask questions. You take a, you know, you engage with them right from the start in terms of designing the research. That would be the paradigm of the convention, but I don't want to screw up your PhD research for you, so you're going to have to get this cleared by your supervisor. Yeah.
Thank you, and we still have time in the end for more discussions, so then we can continue without Janet, and hopefully Hanna will be there, or then we will be.
I think Hanna wants to say something.
Yeah. And do you want to say, Hanna, still something, or should we move? Can we move already before?
I was only thinking about adding one point for Sergei, and the point that was made very well by Janet at the end. Consult your supervisor first and your research community. I was myself involved in drafting the ethical principles for the safeguarding of ICH some years ago, and I remember we were running through plenty of ethical guides and guidelines that are established by different research associations, and each research community has some sort of an ethical protocol to prepare the research. So be sure that you have designed your research according to the acknowledged and established ethical protocol within your discipline, and also that it is approved by probably ethical committee that now every university or even every faculty at some different universities has. So before you engage into research that involves human beings, you usually need to have an approval for ethical standards. So this will be my advice, to make sure that everything is covered and you are not being then questions about the ethics at the end.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And there will be so much good topics to continue, but maybe we move on in the program. So third, we have Dr. Heidi Henriikka Mäkelä from University of Helsinki. And Heidi's background is in folklore studies. So now we have this interdisciplinarity here that Janet was also considering in her presentation. And so Heidi has written articles in many different domains, including music, but also nature and other ICH elements also related to oral tradition in Finland. So Heidi, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Outi and Kansanmusiikki-instituutti for inviting me here. Just a moment, I'll share my slides. Okay, so as it was said, I'm a folklorist and a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Helsinki. And today I shall examine the intangible cultural heritage inventorying in Finland. First, I will discuss the practices of inventorying, as well as introduce the research done in Finland and about Finland. In the last part of my presentation, I will talk about my present study that explores the visual materials of the inventory and concentrates on the bodily representations of Finnishness in the discourses and practices of ICH in Finland. I will scrutinize today the Wiki-Inventory for Living Heritage, as well as the National Inventory of Living Heritage, that are a part of the Finnish implementation of the UNESCO Convention. It was ratified in Finland in 2013. The inventorying process is put into practice by the Finnish Heritage Agency, represented by Leena today here, that controls, administrates, and frames it in cooperation with the Ministry of Education and Culture. And the process is divided into 3 steps. The first stage is the Wiki-Inventory for Living Heritage. That is a wiki-based inventory platform opened in 2016. The Wiki-Inventory is an open access online publication, and it contains approximately 200 submissions at the moment. The material consists of text and pictures. The themes vary from glassmaking tradition and beer culture to picking mushrooms. And the Wiki-Inventory is an interface of institutional and vernacular heritage production. The intangible cultural heritage examples and the Wiki-Inventory submissions are identified and produced by different kinds of smaller and larger societal communities, but the Finnish Heritage Agency controls, administrates, and frames the process of publishing the Wiki-Inventory.
Heidi, I fastly say that they're a little bit blurred, the slides. I don't know exactly why, but I was thinking that did you push when you shared, did you maybe put the box to this optimize? Could that be helping? Or is it bad in the slides?
Let's try again. Is it better now?
It's still a little, no, it's good. Now it's not blurred at all. Yeah.
Okay. No, there was some...
In the previous, it also was good in the start and then it blurred, but I tried to see if it's not readable.
Okay, yeah, just comment something if it happens again. Okay. I was just talking about the second step of the National Inventory of Living Heritage that is based on the entries of the Wiki-Inventory. And it is also published online openly alongside the Wiki-Inventory. The National Inventory is coordinated by the Finnish Heritage Agency, but the selection process is done in cooperation with several societal communities and experts. And the third step is, of course, the UNESCO's representative list of the intangible cultural heritage of humanity that currently includes 3 Finnish examples. The Finnish submissions that are nominated for inscription on UNESCO's international list are chosen from the National Inventory by the Ministry of Education and Culture. The inventorying process also includes the so-called circles of living heritage that are stakeholder networks of Finnish heritage. But unfortunately, I haven't had the possibility to investigate these, so I will today concentrate on the wiki-based processes. As mentioned, the UNESCO's list currently includes 3 Finnish examples. The Ministry of Education and Culture nominated for inscription the Kaustinen fiddle playing and sauna bathing submissions, and they were inscribed in 2020 and 2021. Finland is also a part of the Nordic Klinkerboat tradition submission that was inscribed in 2021. I will next play you a video that is a short version of the candidature film for the nomination of file on sauna culture in Finland in 2020. This will take a moment. I hope you are able to see it.
Saunassa on lämmin ja siellä vähän hämärää. Sitten sinne voi rauhoittua. Ensin peseydytään, mennään sinne lauteille, heitetään löylyä. Näin välissä aina vilouttelemaan. Välillä viihdotaan. Tullaan saunasta pois ja peseydytään.
Kaikki suomalaiset edustavat saunomiskulttuuria. Jokaisella on oma tapansa, oma perinne. Voidaan sanoa, että jokainen on saunomisen asiantuntija.
Suomalaisethan saunoo aina, voisiko näin sanoa, kesäisin saatetaan käydä vaikka joka iltakin, talvisin sitten ehkä vähän harvemmin, mutta se semmoinen yleisin saunapäivä on lauantai. Tämmöisessä vuotuiskierrossa tärkeimmät juhlapyhät joulu ja juhannus erityisesti on semmoisia, mihin valmistaudutaan sitten saunomalla.
Kannattaa saunoa. Mä ehdotan ainakin saunomista monelle. Siinä yhdistyy rentoutuminen ja voi unohtaa kaikki asiat, kaikki päivän asiat. Voit elää sitä hetkeä, mitä elät sillä hetkellä.
Okay, I hope you'll see the slides again. As you could see, the submissions are targeted for outsider gaze, as this video utilizes imageries of Finnishness familiar from tourist and nation branding materials. I later focus more deeply in my presentation on the imageries of Finnishness and discuss how these may, in heritage contexts, reinforce pre-existing structures and identities of gender, class, race, and nation. But before that, let's get back to the practices of the Wiki-Inventory. The wiki-based inventorying was included in the implementation as it was thought to support the aims of collectivity and communality. The Finnish Heritage Agency described this choice in a following way. I quote from Kivilaakso's and Marsio's text. The wiki is an inclusive way of presenting diverse intangible cultural heritage and making it visible. Its ultimate benefit is the enhanced protection and safeguarding of cultural heritage. However, multiple other benefits are evident. The inventory not only raises awareness on cultural heritage, but it also supports local cultural heritage communities in networking and self-expression. By raising awareness and comparability of the heritage, the wiki provides an excellent platform for both cultural heritage communities and academic field for further projects on the subject. Discussions about the wiki raises wider thoughts on cultural heritage as an asset and its meaning to the society in general, quote ends. As the researcher Marta Severo notes, digital media is favored in the ICH production as one of its significant features is the power to create a trace, and all actions on internet are voluntary or involuntarily tracked and recorded. As she states, I quote, "The contribution published on a wiki is the result of the passage from trace to registration. The platform makes it possible to record any change, and then from registration to inscription. This allows us to explain why cultural heritage institutions also attract to participatory digital platforms. They create inscriptions that do not have the fixedness of the document, but which at the same time maintain social value and permanence over time well above the trace." If we go to the Wiki-Inventory, you should now see it. We can easily see the fluidity and non-fixedness of the platform, as all of the changes are well documented and tracked. As you can see the history of changes on the page here. And this is basically the Finnish implementation. You can click these titles and then you can see the submissions. There are only few because this is the English part of the page. The Finnish one would include more submissions. The research on contemporary institutional ICH practices is very scarce as the implementation in Finland is rather new. The concept of ICH, or aineeton kulttuuriperintö in Finnish, have been mainly used in UNESCO-related practices, but it seems that the concept of ICH will gradually replace the older concepts of folklore and folk tradition, kansanperinne in Finnish, at least in institutional contexts such as museums and law. That might be the case in public use as well, as the older concepts that include the word folk may be regarded as too nationally charged or biased. And this is an interesting evolution that needs to be studied thoroughly in the future in Finland. Even though there are, of course, lots of research on Finnish folklore and traditions, I have collected here some references that specifically concentrate on the convention and implementation of ICH in Finland. Some of them are not peer-reviewed journal articles, but more or less lighter overviews. I myself have studied the Wiki-Inventory, especially from the perspective of critical heritage studies. So I'm one of those critical anthropologists that Hanna mentioned. I have concentrated on the production of heritage-sized landscapes related to the national epic Kalevala, the discursive practices that produce, reinforce, and recreate the national we in the Wiki-Inventory, and how food submissions are used to create banal nationalistic understandings on nature and Finnishness, and finally, how the photographs in the national inventory participate in producing gendered and mostly white and middle-class Finnishness. My perspective, that may seem besserwisserish and even irrelevant in the eyes of those who work very often in a very good-hearted way in the field of ICH practices. So my perspective does not imply that the inventorying process has been done in a wrong way or is useless somehow. On the contrary, I very much appreciate the work done in the field. However, I feel that the ethical responsibility of a researcher is to shed light on the controversial and even dark shades that shape the institutional inventorying practices. Thus, the last part of my paper today is based on the article I wrote on the visual material published in the National Inventory. This material consists of 52 submissions and 217 pictures, of which 153 represent humans. Today I concentrate on those pictures. The pictures in the National Inventory are downloaded partly by the submitters and partly by the experts and curators in the Finnish Heritage Agency. All of the images are photographs, and a majority of them are amateur shots of themes that somehow represent the entry. And just a few of the pictures are professional photographs that are clearly targeted, for example, for the tourism sector use. The pictures in the National Inventory are not by any means in the center of the inventory. On the contrary, they are only pictures that are chosen to represent and depict the phenomenon in question. Still, due to their minor role, the photographs are intriguing keyholes through which the performances of nationality and gender may be discussed in detail. I am particularly interested in how Finnishness is embodied in these visual practices. By utilizing visual discourse analysis, I analyze the photographs published in the National Inventory and concentrate on the representations of human bodies. How do the bodies in the pictures represent Finnish cultural heritage? In the National Inventory, cultural heritage is commonly embodied in middle-aged or elderly bodies. The mature body represents traditional knowledge and Finnish heritage. Additionally, both men and women are most often portrayed as representing activities such as working or exercising. The nature of work in the pictures is commonly understood as traditional. Occupations regarded as modern and urban are absent, and historical rural and/or peasant working class occupations such as fishing, tar burning, or glass blowing are emphasized. Hardworkingness is a virtue in the materials, and the white male bodies seen in the pictures underline this feature almost overtly. In pictures 1 and 2, the masculine bodies perform toughness, muscularity, even recklessness as they carry out demanding tasks. The pictures seek to materialize the old times, an imaginary but common temporal expression in Finnish that refers, for example, to the rural pre- and post-war Finnish landscape imageries. Furthermore, Picture 1 reinforces the idea of Finnish heritage as something that is work-centered, simple, physically hard, and far from the Central European heritage ideal of castles, ruins, and upper-class monuments. In the heritization practices, the romantic claim of folk that represents the idealized lower class is present in the photographs that depict rural working class occupations. In picture 2, a man participates in a lumberjack competition. Log driving played historically an important role in the Finnish modernization and forestry, but lumberjacking was considered as an dangerous and uncomfortable labor. In the heritization processes, the dangerousness of the performed activity brings a sense of heroism in the narrative of Finnishness and Finnish work. The male body on the log is a hero who is able to tame the wild nature and flowing rapids. This combines the ideal masculinities of Finnish narratives. Firstly, the category of industrious working class man in the forestry business, and secondly, the category of a classic warrior who is powerful but ready to die and sacrifice himself for the nation's sake. In the pictures, the male bodies do not only represent modern masculinity that could be defined in terms of power, honor, courage, and self-control, but it is shaped by the desire of reaching beyond modernity to the imaginary time of traditions in which the main virtues of a male body were strength and power. Women instead are portrayed in the pictures in a more serene way. The spatial environments of men are often public, outdoors, or in nature, when women's worlds seem to be home or home-like indoor environments such as kitchens. In the national inventory pictures, women knit, sew, make lace, bake, or cook. In picture 3, the women are knitting together. In picture 4, the ladies bake traditional pastries. Their hardworkiness is more discreet, but their active hands produce large amounts of food, which indicate mother-like care, collectivity, and warm solidarity. Motherhood has been a central category in constructing the Finnish nation. Even the virginal figure of the Finnish maid has also been depicted paradoxically as a mother in some cases. Finland itself has been occasionally seen as a mother that protects her citizens. When interpreted in the context of the national inventory and compared to the pictures of men, pictures 3 and 4 seem to reinforce the construct of a woman as a biological and ideological reproducer of the nation. The mother-like baking older women indicate the Finnish foremothers, whose task has been to repeatedly perform the duties of mothers and housewives in the private environment of home. Overall, the national inventory photographs tend to place the body in a metaphoric heterosexual national family that is a male-headed household in which both sexes have a natural role to play. The past is very commonly constructed in the national inventory through connections to nature that is understood as something non-urban but rarely outright wilderness. In the national inventory pictures, nature represents the primitive past and the tamed wilderness that is left behind, but nature is also something admired, uncanny, almost frightening, and powerful. The national inventory photographs include very few urban environments, and most of them are located in rural-like forested surroundings that are simultaneously everywhere and nowhere in Finland. The forested landscape in the pictures is almost like a non-place, or a stereotypical background that represent the Finnish national spatiality and its past. The landscapes seen in the pictures are rural environments that remind of the forested imagery of the national romanticism. In the national inventory, nature is a place into which people go and practice heritage activities such as orienteering, foraging wild greens, or mushroom picking. The activities and the repeated movements bodies make in the practices connect people with the past. Hence, as nature is understood as representing the Finnish pastness, activities in nature are regarded even more traditional and thus worth heritization. In the national inventory photographs, bodies enter the so-called primitive past as they go to nature. The forest landscape that once was a symbol of backwardness and periphery is now a landscape of national heritage in which modern Finns are able to be in contact with the past. In pictures 5 and 6, the forest landscapes, the act of picking mushrooms or wild greens, and the traditional old-fashioned baskets made of splints create a black cloth of deep time spans that utilize the stereotypical symbols of Finnishness, such as the naturalized connections between humans and forest landscape and artifacts made of wood. Ideas of unspoiled and pre-modern nature are significant in creating the connections between the past and the present, also in bodily representations. One of the examples of this is the sauna bathing entry that introduces the idea of Finnish corporality as naked but non-sexual, something that is regarded as natural. Picture 7 is a prominent example of this. The photograph taken from tourism sector use introduces a group of happily smiling people in a wooden sauna interior. The traditional sauna equipment function as a semiotic symbol of Finnishness, but their pre-modernity and primitivity also mark deep time spans and connections to forest landscape as they are made of wood. The bodies in the middle represent the ideal of non-sexual nudity that is often associated with the Finnish sauna culture. Sauna pictures have been a part of the Finnish tourism imagery since the 1930s, but at the beginning of the 20th century, they were regarded as obscene. Today, the sauna pictures represent Finnish or Northern exoticism in the imageries of country branding. However, the tourism sector tries to avoid too primitive or sexually loaded impressions in sauna bathing pictures, which has led to emphasis on amenity, enjoyment, and collectivity. Consequently, picture 7 balances between the fear of being too primitive and the ideal of non-sexual corporality. Furthermore, picture 8 can be interpreted as an interface in which the ideals of Finnish naturalness, landscape, and the gendered white body meet. The young woman sitting on the small wooden dock refer to the image of the pure and virginal Finnish maid, who was quite often depicted naked or revealingly clad. As the photograph is published in the sauna bathing submission, the women are positioned as though they have just left the steamy sauna for cooling off on the small dock. This indicates that they are washed up, which connotes, of course, purity. The women seem to become one with the landscape, and the landscape becomes one with them, as the pure and virginal lake landscape surrounds them and even touches them as their feet are soaked in the water. The National Inventory photographs show a very homogeneous image of Finnishness. The sun is shining and beautiful nature surrounds all. In the National Inventory, cultural heritage is often seen as something happy, joyous, and worth of celebrating. The darker sides of heritage are absent in the National Inventory. For example, the mnemonic practices of remembering the Finnish Civil War or the World War II are not emphasized. This is rather surprising in the context of Finland, as the narratives of war are often considered as one of the most important ways of narrating Finnishness and the Finnish past. In the National Inventory, the narratives of war are replaced with narratives and symbols of nature and collectivity and the everyday, which of course serves well, for example, the tourism sector that is one of the benefiting areas of heritage inventorying. The National Inventory photographs are interesting keyholes to the ways Finnishness is embodied in the heritization practices in the 21st century Finland. The pictures perform the Finnish we group to others. They invite the outsider gaze to praise Finnishness and Finnish heritage. The institutional processes of producing and categorizing heritage have been acknowledged in many studies as systems that reinforce pre-existing structures and identities of gender, class, race, and nation. Indeed, the category of Finnishness seems to be understood in the materials in a rather stereotypical and normative way. However, is it possible to represent it in some other way. One of the difficulties in this is the participatory nature of the inventory itself. People tend to affectively adhere to the narratives of Finnishness they have learned in their childhood. Simultaneously, they tend to submit things to the Wiki-Inventory that they think Finnish Heritage Agency wishes to hear. This causes an Ouroboros situation in which the institutions emphasize things such as diversity and locality, and the participating people emphasize the national scale. This is, of course, not the case in every submission in the Wiki-Inventory, and other weak groups, such as local, are created and maintained as well. And of course, the national scale is inherently embedded in the work of institutions, such as the Finnish Heritage Agency, as well as to the processes UNESCO maintain. However, in my mind, it is one of the future challenges of the inventorying processes to balance between the scales and we groups in a way that diverse voices and imageries can be brought forth. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Heidi. This was excellent example of how to conduct research on ICH. Thank you so much. And so I take questions again to Heidi. Yes, Leena, you're welcome.
You can assume that I'm the one most eager to raise my hand, having worked with the inventory since 2016. So Heidi, first of all, thank you for your research. It's truly fascinating to be listening to you. I've read your articles, but it's still different to hear you analyzing it. There's going to be a question in the end, but a couple of comments before that. So first of all, I mean, on the framework, what are the inventories about? This is one of the few obligatory parts of the convention that when we are state parties, we need to make an inventory. And what we did was to look at the convention and 15 other countries. How have they been working with the conventions? And we really wanted to go for a wiki inventory, not kind of a thing where it is applied like for a grant and then a big bunch of academic researchers sitting on it and thinking what could be and then announcing, but rather to have an open, easy way to participate for different kind of communities. So it's quite a special framework. It's special in the wiki, but the more you go up on the ladders on the national inventory and to the UNESCO, I often refer it to a toolbox. It's a toolbox that says UNESCO, and if you want to take sauna and put it into it, it needs a bit of squeezing to fit in. And when listening to you, I'm thinking a lot on the role of the coordinator, me as the coordinator, or the role of the agency as the implementer of the convention. So when we look at these pictures, are we looking at the UNESCO convention? Are we looking at the thoughts of the agency or the advisory board, or are we actually looking at how people see the heritage? So the process goes so that we advertise a call to the wiki inventory, or now actually we have the call for the national inventory open for the coming months. And then someone hears this call and is like, yes, I want to participate. I want to write in it. Then they go and write. And what is nice about the wiki is that it is actually a lot of diverse voices. So it's over 200 articles who all have their own voices. Contrary to many of my colleagues, we don't rewrite the text. We help a bit with the editing and with the language. But what we see in the wiki and what you read in the wiki, they are mainly made by communities. And we are actually quite proud of it. But I remember when I read your first article on sort of the diversity, and especially you were bringing out the notion of Kalevala and sort of ancient tradition, what's in it. I haven't thought about it. And sort of how much do we need to be steering the process? Or I was like, oh, should we taking more look into Kalevala? And if someone tries to mention, we should be like, are you sure you want to mention Kalevala? Because it comes from the communities and also the photos. So I think your research is a really good eye-opener for us. I think we've been looking into the diversity aspects, and we're really happy now that we're getting more and more articles from, for example, from immigrant backgrounds. But for example, if in the community, if some of the elements, it is mainly made by men in their 50s or women in their 60s, should we say that, no, find the junior from your group? And I mean, of course, there are juniors, and this is definitely something where we need to have a closer look on that. Well, then you picked up the sauna case, and I don't maybe comment it that then further than just refer to that UNESCO toolbox. How do you squeeze something into it? But there also both the video that you saw, it's made by the sauna community. Of course, we had a say in it, and I was policing quite much on how up do you lift the are there breasts, for example, and what are we when we are presenting something to UNESCO? It's not only the sauna community or the bearers of this heritage, but it's actually the state of Finland. And when we work in such a context where there are so many different kind of cultures, and for example, such cultures where even showing a woman's ankle is like not the thing to do. It's like, can we scrub our element of nudity into other people's faces, or are we like saying it once, we go to the sauna and we take our clothes off? So it's really about balancing. So I had a nice line where I would end up, but I don't find it from my notes, but just want to thank you for your excellent work and for being the eye-opener for us in this process.
Thank you, Lena. I think this is exactly the thoughts I have been also thinking about, and I think you struggle with the same kind of things. That first of all, you said that these pictures or these photographs or these videos, they come from the communities, and you not participate that much on the institutional level on those processes. And that's what I've been thinking about, that somehow people tend to enhance the national scale when they produce these materials, and somehow they think that the Finnish Heritage Agency wants to hear the national scale, and so no can do kind of situation, that if the community wants to kind of participate in these kinds of processes, of course there has to be space for that. And I think at the institutional level, the work you have done, that you have tried to kind of enhance the voice of you said the immigrants or other minorities in Finland, and that's the work that has to be done in addition to these kind of imageries and discourses you get from the field. Yeah, but I have heard that people have been very kind of pleased with the Finnish implementation, and the Wiki-Inventory has been an exception in the UNESCO implementations in the whole world. So it's kind of a very cool thing in this world.
Yes, Hanna can maybe move on.
Yes, thank you. It was really very interesting presentation. And I have two questions, one to Lena maybe, and the other one to Heidi. I was thinking how you came up with the idea to create this Wiki inventory, because you could go to plenty other ways and modes, but you were, so how did it happen? And as you were very, I would say, successful in promoting this approach to inventorying, do you, at least from what I could observe in the last years at the UNESCO level, have you already have some followers? Do you know some countries or some regions that went this way? And this will be to Lena. And to Heidi, I was thinking that actually, and this also connects to Lena's commentary about this censorship that is being actually, that is happening with the nudity that is in sauna. I think that the message that is now sent via these pictures and the heritage or tourism agencies to the world is that you can easily go to, and you can only go to sauna in Finland either in a bathing suit or with a towel, which is not the case, as we know. And this is creating in a way a false picture. I was wondering about some intermediary way, like respecting the different, I would say, sensitivities of different cultures, because you get the exposition to international level, but at the same time, you know, a small, you know, commentary like, please note that we did this video, or we particularly have chosen this picture in order to respect our sensitivities, but how we really do it in Finland is full naked. Or, you know, because in a way we are creating, you know, a new image of sauna culture in Finland, and this tradition that has nothing to do with reality. So these were my thoughts, and I will be happy to hear your answers and comments. Thank you.
If I may quickly comment on the choosing the wiki format, as mentioned, we did quite a vast research on 15 different countries and also their inventories, what they are like. And we quite soon thought that the wiki way of going would be our thing. I mean, people are literate, and a big majority is able to produce text and is sort of has the access to online resources and so on. So for us to go around the country and me making notes and writing on behalf of them would not make any sense. We did have some examples. I'm looking at Joanne and Scotland. You are a bit ahead of us. And then also the South Korean example, ICHpedia was one of them. But I mean, we've been asked for advice by some countries, which I actually don't remember now. But I think this is something when also many countries who are sort of seeing that, oh, this is actually our way to do the inventorying work is not maybe the thing to do nowadays. So then when they are renewing their systems, they are going more into this way. But it's easy access for many kinds of people. One example, we have 30 articles by children on our Wiki-Inventory. So they write short text, it's called Our Heritage, and then they write what they like. It's part of their schoolwork or hobby or something. So, but even children can participate.
Yeah, I can comment that censorship thing. Well, I think it's a hard thing to balance between, just like Leena said, that it's a hard thing to balance between what the communities produce and what the kind of authentic or real image behind that is. So I kind of understand the role of Finnish National Heritage Agency, that they do not kind of intervene into those processes and comment something like this is not real. I kind of understand that kind of role would be very hard, but I not yeah. Then again, the other part is that of course no one bathes in sauna with a swimming suit on. So well, I don't have a clear answer to this, but it's a very interesting kind of this whole thing, the censorship, the balancing between these two parties.
Thank you. I already I say in this between that we continue the discussion still 8 minutes to 4 p.m. But I already thank those who has to leave already now, and thank you so much, Janet, Hanna, and Heidi for participating this webinar. This was excellent chance to learn more about ICH, and now we can discuss a little while still, like freely, and take questions. So Joanne, you're the next question. Thank you.
Thank you, and great to hear the presentation on the inventory. I'm just writing about that at the moment for a practitioner's perspective book I'm doing. And I think what's interesting is the Scotland wiki was 2011, the first iteration, and then 2015. But Scotland, as part of the UK, has not ratified the convention. So that pipeline to the national inventory wasn't a constriction because we couldn't put anything on the list. So there was a lot more freedom in terms of the initial thinking around the wiki, and by the organization I was working for commissioned the research around it. But it was heavily criticized at the very start. People were absolutely appalled that there was no moderation, and that these were not expertly curated, quite vitriolic, as well as the inclusive definition that Scotland adopted of ICH in Scotland, not Scottish ICH, because it was an inclusive definition of the migrant communities. And at the time, I had people come up and say, how can you, it has to be generation to generation, and kind of missing the point that, this participative approach actually was moving the thinking forward. And now it's completely accepted. Everybody does that. So I think what I'm saying is that there's no perfect way, and it's great to have the critique and to point the things that you've just sort of laid out, because it's like, oh, right, okay, we hadn't thought about that. How can we move forward? How can we improve? But it's that participatory approach. And one of the things I've noticed, interestingly, the wiki approach, when we did that, we had a partnership with Wikimedia and a Wikimedian in residence, and Wikipedia was so excited. They said, we're going to get all our Wikimedians to do wiki in articles. And we were like, but they're not the bearers, and they're not the tradition bearers. So we said no. And then I've noticed Wiki loves, and I'm opening up Wikipedia, and it's like, put your folklore on, it's changed, times change. But the initial wiki, just point that the only moderation was the spam filters. And that wiki never really had any problems. It's small events, very small numbers, but from the bearers. And I think that's to your point, Lena, that being proud of that actually it's coming from the bearers. And sometimes we don't like what we read. And I've spoken to other countries. I said, how do you deal with really, controversial things? And it's that split, local inventory, national inventory. So I think this thinking and critique really helps to move the dialogue on. And thank you for that presentation. So, and any more thoughts? Love to hear.
Thank you very much. It's so fascinating to hear about the Scottish example. And I think, Lena, can you say something about this? But you do participate a little bit more in the administration of the wiki page than in the Scottish version.
Yes, we administer it, so everything can pop up on its own, but we do check them through, and we sort of keep a certain quality level so that they are replying in the minimum length of words or signs or whatever, and that they tell about the communities and how is it done, about the history and so on. So we do participate more than them. And I think maybe one, and we also need to have a community behind. So in comparison to Wikipedia, for example, it cannot be just one person. So it's usually an NGO or some kind of institution, but also a list of names. If there isn't an NGO, then it can be names of practitioners, so that we accept as well. So there's always a group of people. And we say they are open, and they are open for modification and so on, and they need to be updated every 3 years.
There are some questions on chat.
Xingwen, do you want to say it aloud, or should I read it from the chat? Maybe I read.
Yes, I can just ask directly. Thank you for giving me the time, and thanks Dr. Mäkelä to provide such interesting explanation research, and also I appreciate Joanne's complimentary explanation of a Scottish example. I was just curious if because when I studied Finnish culture, I learned as a foreigner, so I have been try to understand how Finnish think about Finnishness and how I myself perceive Finnishness. And when I learned Finnish literature, I remember we discussed Seven Brothers in class, and we talk about in Finnish novel there are many works in which you can find women act as a strong person, and men act as relatively animals who needs protection or forgiveness. So I think that is very interesting characteristics, And I was wondering if it was also concerned by Finnish people when they provide this, when you create this inventory. Thank you.
Well, I'm not a part of the inventorying practices in a way that I'm not involved in the administration or anything of the Wiki-Inventory in a way than Finnish Heritage Agency and Leena is. But about your questions about kind of, yes, I recognize the idea that there is this strong Finnish woman kind of stereotype. It's a very, very, very common narrative in Finnish heritage narratives. But the other parts that I recognize in the national inventory, the kind of idea that Finnishness is related to hardworkingness, for example, that's also a very shared value in the society as a whole. Or that Finnishness is something related to nature, and the Finnish heritage is something that is not related to European castles and upper class monuments, but something more vernacular and more low class things. And I think that's also shared in the society in a broader level as well. Yeah, but thank you for your question.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you all. This was so great discussion, and the time is already 4 p.m. So I think we have to leave Giacomo's question probably to the next time, unfortunately.
No problem.
Yeah, yeah. You can ask it from Heidi directly afterwards. And thank you everyone so much for this great discussion. It was great to be here.
Just one thing, could we have the classical photo if everybody who wants to show their face would like to show it now and wave a lot?
Yeah.
So just a second.
Screenshot.
Yes, is everybody waving who is present? 1, 2, 3, now. Okay.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And we have a participant list in the chat box. Is a link where you can send your hopes to the next webinars in future. So it would be great if you fill out the form and give you your ideas what we would have next time. And thank you all. It was great to see you here. Hopefully we see you in the next webinar.